very, very important for motor output. And what the cerebellum really is so important about is timing. And it's timing of movements. And the big thing that it seems to be doing is it compares the sensory input of what your body is actually doing by using skin sensors, joint sensors. What are you actually doing versus what did you want to do? So it's comparing actual movement to intended movement, and it tries to get them closer and closer together. So it's very important for timing of contractions and relaxations. So cerebellar loss or injury leads to incoordinate movement. Incoordinate movement means being uncoordinated, or discoordinate, D-Y-S coordinate. So there's a loss of timing, and when people have cerebellar loss or injury, they just automatically slow down to compensate. They slow down. And there's this process called overshoot that I mentioned to you that people with cerebellar injury, because if I'm going to try to point at that projector, if I go to point, I can't time the shut off of my contractions and I go past it. So I try to correct and I go past again, I go past again. So you kind of do like that. And as you're trying to hold still on something, you can have what's called an intention tremor. During an intended movement, you'll get a tremor because you're going back and forth trying to correct to hold on it. And here's an example of an intention tremor, and hopefully it just won't be too. Oh, great, we get to have I thought I took care of the cats earlier. So there's really no audio to this. Okay, he's fine on that side. He's trying to point at one specific spot there. And look at his entire arm. You can just see his entire arm. His forearm, his upper arm, everything is trying to compensate there. Everything. So during an intended movement, that's when you see the tremor. We'll see the opposite of that coming up with what's called a relaxation tremor. He was fine when he was relaxed. Because when he did an intentional movement, you saw the tremor. There'll be other ones, like what you see early on with Parkinson's. It's a relaxation tremor. When somebody's relaxed, there's a tremor. And then when they go to move, it smooths out. It smooths out. We'll talk about that on this slide. So, cerebellum is very important for modulating motor output to get the movement that you want. Your basal, I meant to get rid of that. It's your basal nuclei, not your basal ganglia. Ganglia are in the periphery, and for years it was inappropriately called the basal ganglia. When you're in the central nervous system, we call it nuclei. So, for the dental students, because the national board exam still had it incorrect, I meant to take that off for you guys. And anyway, just think basal nuclei. And these also function in smoothing out and coordinating voluntary movement. And so it's receiving information from the cerebral cortex and sending it back to the cerebral cortex. And you have a whole series of these basal nuclei. And when you have a lesion or some type of damage in any one of these, you do tend to see some deficit or some really strange movements that you go, okay, this is probably associated with damage in this one area. And when I was in grad school down in New Orleans on Thursday in the neuroscience class, they'd bring in patients with the cerebellar, or well, with different types of neurological disorders, then, you know, some of these dudes, you know, it's like, wow, you never stand on the right side of this guy, because he couldn't help it, just, you know, he'd slap you upside the face. I don't understand how it hurt you, but you don't need to memorize these, but I do want you to take note about the substantia nigra. But at least do understand that there's different basal nuclei that when they're damaged, for example, Putmans tend to get flicking of the hands and face, kind of ticking movement. Globus pallidus, excuse me, it's not unusual to have this writhing type movement. Yeah, limb flailing with the subthalamic nucleus, but in the substantia nigra, this is what's often associated with Parkinson's tremors. And so where the heck are these basal nuclei? They're down here. There's a whole bunch of these. They're all these darkened areas. And in the substantia nigra, you have a number of dopamine secreting neurons. And one of the things that happens in Parkinson's, for whatever reason, there are different reasons, these dopamine releasing neurons, so that'd be a dopaminergic neuron, they're lost. Lost meaning they deteriorate, they're degraded, they're attacked by the body in some cases. And when you lose those dopamine secreting neurons, it changes the motor output to different areas. And here's an old recording that's on YouTube, and the guys who are into neurology say, you know, this is just a perfect example of what it looks like. So here's a gentleman who has an early Parkinson's gait. And all of these basal nuclei help us with coordinating movement in a way similar to the cerebellum. So you can tell he has to be very careful. Watch when he turns. You can see this quivering of the legs. He's very, very careful with his movement so he doesn't fall down. So this is without drugs. This is the way his day goes. And now this is, I think it was 30 minutes after getting L-Dopa, which is a precursor to dopamine. A pretty substantial difference. And sometimes patients can be treated at least for a period of time, with those types of medications, but it tends to progress and progress and progress. Now, all the basal nuclei play a role in timing and scaling of movements, turning things on, turning things off, moving just the right amount. And they are associated, more closely associated, especially Parkinson type tremors, with relaxation tremor early on. Relaxation tremor is when the affected body part, when you're just relaxed, that affected body part will have a tremor. And think about it. There is, what is a tremor? Contraction on one side of the joint, followed by contraction on the other side of the joint. And so early on, you can have these slow tremors like this. But when it progresses, it can be finer and finer tremors, with both sides fighting the other until, what is spastic rigidity? Spastic rigidity is both sides contracting at the same time. And that's where it can progress to. So there's flaccid paralysis, and then there is spastic paralysis. And this would be an example of spastic paralysis. Both sides are contracting and it's leading to this rigid state. Now, early on, you'll see these relaxation tremors, and probably many of you have seen people with this. So here's somebody who, when he's relaxed, that left hand, it's just dancing around. But watch when he goes to do an intended movement. Early on, he's rock steady. Now this will may deteriorate with him, but that's a perfect example of a relaxation tremor. When he's relaxed, there's a tremor. When he goes into an intentional movement, it stops. So there's intention tremors or relaxation tremors. Do know basically what they are, when they occur, what they tend to be associated with it. And then there's this idiopathic essential tremor which actually makes up a pretty good percentage of the tremor, and bottom line is not exactly sure what is causing it. And sometimes you hear people who the tremor is really noticed in their voice, and sometimes you just, their hands are dancing, or when they're walking, they have that tremor. And that, so there are other sources of tremors other than cerebellar lesions or basal nuclei lesions. I threw this in. What can you do for some of these folks that have Parkinson's, tremors, and so forth? Medication helps a lot of people for a certain period of time, and deep brain stimulation is used where they put an electrode into those areas of the brain that have the deficit, and then you have to tune this just right, with the right amount of intensity, the right frequency, and the right amplitude of stimulation. And I've known people that have had this. The father of one of my previous students had this done. He worked with his hands, and it basically gave him his career back, and I know he was still doing well with it 4 years later on. Somebody I knew for years and years and years, his Parkinson's was getting really bad, and he had this, and boy, he smoothed right out. And I don't know if this is just pure anecdote or if it's seen more widely. You're going to learn about that. I don't know. But I was just amazed how he could feed himself, he could do everything for himself again. His movements were kind of slow, but he was smoothed out, he could do things. And one time I was at a party with him, and I sat down and talked to him, and I said, man, I've really been impressed with how your movements have changed. And he goes, yeah. I said, but it seems like there's something else going on with you. He said, yeah, there is, yeah.
Oh, my grandfather actually has that.
A deep brain stimulation?
Yeah. And it actually didn't change his tremor that much, but it definitely reduced the amount of medication that he had to take. So tons of symptoms, or his side effects.
Yeah, exactly, because some of those medications have big side effects. So that's a win.
Yeah,
for him.
definitely.
That was a win for him. What did it do to his mood?
I definitely made his mood a lot better.
Okay, made his grandfather's mood a lot better. This guy, he said he was thankful, he was so happy he could do things for himself again, because his motor performance had degraded to the point where, and this was an independent man, that other people were having to do things for him, and he just truly hated that. But when I was talking to him that one night, how are you dealing with all this? And he says, don't tell me this, don't tell me this. But he said, it's kind of like the color has come out of my life. What do you mean by that? And I'm thinking, his vision's changed. And he said, no, I don't get excited about things. Everything's just a little bit. And he says, I kind of feel gray instead of color, the color of life. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was almost devastated to hear that. It made me so sad, because you know, here, his quality of life, and he didn't want anybody to know it. And I, for the longest time, probably was the only one to do it. And, you know, those little things that bring you joy in life, for whatever reason, in his case, they were dampened. In your grandfather's case, he felt better about things. And so, boy, so I do get the impression, although I don't really know, that response can be somewhat varied. Now, in his case, his tremors really went down. Medication went down too. And, but thank goodness. How long has your grandfather had it now?
6 years.
6 years. That is great, because sometimes over time, these lose their effectiveness. And boy, once you go out to 6 years, you think that you're going to be effective for quite a while like this. Boy, that's awesome. That is awesome. So there's a lot of different manipulations. One, and basically what they're doing is putting electrodes into a pathway to try to replace some of the lost stimulation. Okay, so let's go down farther. Yes?
So is the essential tremor still part of Parkinson's?
No, essential tremor is something that's idiopathic, meaning you don't know what's causing it. Essential tremor is a tremor of unknown origin, really.
Okay.
And so you kind of do a shotgun approach to just decrease motor output. You're going to learn more about it. So there's I just want you to appreciate there's all sorts of sources of tremor. It's not just necessarily cerebellar or basal nuclei. There's other things that happen in the nervous system as well, some of which are tough to figure out.
So Parkinson's is typically the relaxation tremor.
Yes.
I just wasn't sure because the article says that that's treating Parkinson's, but it's also treating an essential tremor.
Oh, yeah, yes, exactly. This one down here, this is Parkinson's.
Okay,
I had another video that
okay.
this doesn't go with that.
Okay.
I just wasn't gonna play that. I wasn't gonna play this one, but there's a different area of the brain for essential tremor that in some patients, if you stimulate, you help essential tremor. But it doesn't help all essential tremor. That's why it's tough to deal with this one. Yeah, this article on that one, they don't do it.
Okay.
Glad you picked that up, because I'm sure other people did too. Okay, when you go down to the spinal cord, there's a lot of functions. Yes, we've talked about neural highways, ascending sensory neural highways in the spinal cord going up to the brainstem, and then there's descending motor pathways going down the spinal cord. But there's so much other circuitry, reflex circuitry that's built into the spinal cord that a lot of the movements of your body is really the upper neurological centers activating those circuits that are built into your spinal cord and say, okay, start the movement now, speed it up, slow it down, make it a little bit bigger. But the point is, the circuitry is actually built into the spinal cord. So, and that's what this is, has neural circuitry for protective and beneficial reflexes and movement patterns. So this is part of that automatic sequence of life. Things that you don't even have to think about that are built into the synaptic machinery of the spinal cord. So there's some things in here, and just as an example of that, your spinal reflexes. We're going to look at a stretch reflex, we're going to look at a tension reflex. So there's muscle spindles that are part of our sensory or muscle sensory ability to sense stretch. Now think about it. Your muscles do not want to be overstretched. It would tear the muscle tissue. So you have a sensory apparatus built into, I should say a sensory system built into many, but not all muscles, that sense if muscle is being stretched too much or at too rapid a rate. And what does it do? It causes a reflex contraction to help prevent further stretching. The Golgi tendon reflex, that senses tension. Every one of you in this room has the ability for muscle contractions that you cannot believe. You can generate so much force, you will damage your musculoskeletal system. You can break bone. your body doesn't want you to do that. So it prevents you from generating so much tension and then so much force on your bony attachments to keep you from fracturing the bone or pulling the insertion right out. It will turn off the motor output to keep you from doing that. Those types of things are built in. First thing we're going to talk about are the muscle spindles. The muscle spindles are part of the stretch reflex, the sensing of stretch in muscle. The muscle spindles are found on intrafusal muscle fibers. Sensory neurons wrap around the fibers centrally. They sense magnitude of stretch. They sense rate of stretch. So static stretch is magnitude, how much it's being stretched. Rate of stretch is dynamic stretch, how fast it's happening. And not only do they have sensory neurons, they also have gamma efferent motor neurons that are very important for making the muscle spindle fibers, the intrafusal fibers, this correct length. So here's one of these muscle spindle fibers, also called intrafusal fibers, that they're buried in the belly of many muscles in the body. Not all muscles, but many muscles, and several muscles. So right here in the central, this is actually a sensory neuron. This will sense when this muscle fiber is stretched. And when it's activated, it sends impulses to the central nervous system saying, we're being overstretched, either too much or too fast. And here are gamma motor neurons that are innervating the ends of these that can cause these ends to contract. So there's a sensory portion, there's a motor portion, okay? So where the heck are these intrafusal muscle fibers? So let's just do something that all of us are familiar with. We're going to do a patellar tendon reflex that you've had during physicals. You may have already started doing them in history and physicals. Have you been tapping? Not yet. But you'll be tapping all sorts of tendons, not just the knees, all sorts of tendons when you're learning history and physicals, because it tells you if the integrity of that area is intact, and it also tells you something about upper motor traffic too. So here's an intrafusal muscle fiber. Does it exist 1 foot above your quadricep? No, and I'm just generically going quadricep and not the individual muscles. They're actually buried within the belly of many, many muscles. So the muscle spindles are found with these intrafusal muscle fibers. The vast majority of the muscle fiber of any muscle group are extrafusal muscle fibers. They're the tension generating. The extrafusal muscle fibers are the tension generating muscle fibers. The intrafusal muscle fibers, their job is to sense the stretch that's occurring on that muscle group. So they're actually buried within this muscle. So let's say, and I'm putting it up here just so you can visualize it a little bit better. Here you have a Taylor percussion instrument, a little rubber hand. And you swat the patellar tendon. What does that do? That very quickly stretches that muscle very, very rapidly. So this muscle spindle on this intrafusal fiber, it senses that stretch, and it depolarizes. It has sensory receptors, it depolarizes. And what does that do? That will send an afferent sensory impulse to the spinal cord. So this is part of the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. It's sending a sensory impulse from the periphery to the central nervous system, so it's going to come in the dorsal nerve root. Everything you've learned up to this point, right? There, it's going to synapse directly with a motor neuron. So it synapses right here, and then that motor neuron, that's part of the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, that's going to run out the anterior ventral motor neuron, and this runs out and it innervates the extrafusal muscle fiber. So if you have a rapid stretch that exceeds the stretch threshold, your body's response is to have that muscle contract very quickly. It's called the stretch reflex. And what does that contraction do? It arrests or prevents any further stretching of the muscle. It's protective. It's a protective mechanism. And you notice there's only one synapse here, so this is said to be monosynaptic. So what happens when you tap somebody on the patellar tendon, that muscle contracts, and you see the result of that knee kick. Okay? So let's just do this a few times, because you know sometimes you're stressed out and you just want to pound on a patient. Okay, so you tap, you activate the muscle spindles, you send sensory information to the spinal cord, and it's being sent out to that muscle to prevent it from overstretching. Now, this doesn't need to go to the brain. You don't need to think about it. This is a reflex. There's an afferent limb and an efferent limb. It happens automatically. Thank goodness. And this is throughout the body. It's not in every muscle, but it's in many, many muscles throughout the body. This is built into the spinal cord. With the dental students, I talk about stretch reflexes. For example, if you tap somebody on the jaw right here, you get a reflex closing. Really, really powerful. So that information comes in at the brainstem. So sensations from the oral cavity come into the brainstem. So you have these stretch reflexes in muscles throughout the body. And we utilize this all the time. Now, clinically, why do this? Number one, it tells you if this is intact. Okay, that's fine. And see if this is intact. But you have a lot of descending motor suppression traffic coming from your brain going down to dampen motor movements. You don't want wild, jerky movements. So you have a lot of descending modulatory information that just naturally moderates your motor output of your limbs. Somebody who has some lesion or some type of deficit in those descending modulatory tracts, they have a very exaggerated knee-jerk reflex. So yep, you want to see if this is intact, but you know, boy, when I was in that accident getting hit by the dump truck, they were tapping me all over to see if I had damage in my descending motor tracts that were modulating this to see if I had inappropriate stretch reflex reactions. Because they were looking at damage, where the damage was in the spinal cord. Yeah.
Will you sometimes get no response?
Pardon
If
me,
there's
no
damage?
response? There are different things that will lead to no response, yes. If you have a problem with the descending suppression, if there is a problem here, yes, there's ways you get no response, and that will tell you. Hyper response tells you something, no response tells you something, a normal response tells you something. And you have to do it on both sides and in other areas to see what's normal for the person. Some people, that's normal, other people it's that. So you have to do it in different muscles to see kind of what's normal. What's normal for people. So you have sensory input coming in, you have motor output going out. Okay, so you want this to be sensed, and you want to have your body needs this information in real time. So if you're preventing some type of overstretching of the muscle, you need to have this going very fast. So it's not surprising your body is wired up with A-alpha neurons for the sensory and A-alpha motor neurons for the efferent too. Because this is a protective reflex, you need this information and the reaction very, very quickly. So it's big, heavily myelinated A-alpha nerve fibers. And also, you also have gamma motor neurons, as I showed you in the other slide, going to the ends of those intrafusal fibers. And They're both going to be going on. Now, we use this stretch reflex all the time, and it's not, it's so automatic we don't even know about it. But think about any sport that you've ever played. You played baseball or softball, and when you're going to hit the ball, you don't just go forward. You go back real quickly. That puts this on stretch reflex, and you have a more explosive motor output. If you really want to see what your vertical jump is, yep, doing a flat-footed vertical jump tells you something, but if you have somebody step into it with 1 or 2 steps, when you step into it forcefully, that stretches the quads, you take advantage of that, you get a stretch reflex allowing stronger motor output. So many things that you do naturally in motor performance, you're activating the stretch reflex to get a more powerful muscle reaction. It also helps you in something you wouldn't even think about. If you're doing very fine motor work, and you guys started practicing suturing yet? Okay, come on. There's a lot of things you're going to be doing with very fine hand skills. And many of you have probably noticed this. If you're just really tense and trying to do fine motor movement, if somebody bumps you, your hand just snaps back to your original position. That, believe it or not, is due to the stretch reflex. So, and I should mention, you know, that's one of the things it does with the hands, but in your day-to-day life, walking down a set of stairs, you wouldn't think about it, but the stretch reflex helps you with the arrest. When you stop and you're descending, you don't want to just keep descending, you want to pop back. And boy, you notice it when you lose this. Years and years ago, I mentioned very briefly that I ran the Lincoln Half Marathon a few times, ran the Lincoln Marathon once. I survived the Lincoln Marathon once. And a week and a half before, everybody at the medical center, the M1 class, and I was taking the first year medical school courses for my master's program, we all got the flu. And it was a bad gastrointestinal flu. So we were vomiting and diarrhea, all sorts of things to cause electrolyte imbalance. But, you know, by Wednesday, and the marathon was on Sunday, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm going to run the marathon. I'm okay. And the wife who always had a better perspective, I think you ought to back down to the half. No, I feel good. I feel good. And boy, for 14 miles, I felt good. Right on time. At 17 miles, I felt, what was that? Huh, had a little cramp. How about that? Between 17 miles and 21 miles, I think everything in my body cramped. From my big toe to my earlobes, and I'm just like, oh my goodness! And I mean, I was drinking electrolytes, and it was just like, I was cramping on both sides of the joint, so I'm just basically at this point just dancing on my toes, and right at the 21-mile mark, which was out at Holmes Lake, you know, there's a police officer directing traffic. He says, I'm a trained observer, and I observe you're in agony. Checked and served, thank you. You know, and really think about what you're doing when you're cramping on both sides is you're yanking your spindles left and right. You're yanking your spindles left and right. So I damaged my spindles, damaged my spindles. The next day, I didn't have to go to work. I thought, I'm going to get up and go for a walk, start walking off any soreness, prevent it later on. And I come to the first curb. I was living in Omaha. I stepped down on the first curb. I didn't know I didn't have a stretch reflex. I stepped down a little bitty street curb and boom, went to the ground. Anybody see that? Nobody saw it. Well, that was kind of strange. And I'm walking along, and I go up a curb, no problem. I step down another curb, with the other leg, boom. I start going down. Well, this is interesting. We lived in a basement apartment. I found out I had to get on my hands, knees, and back down the steps. Well, this is strange. I didn't even think about it. And then that afternoon, my wife and sister-in-law went running, and my sister-in-law has never done anything like this before. But I remember I went walking while they were jogging, and I was taking a drink at the water fountain, and I just stopped taking a drink, and she walks up behind me, and little kids do this. We were grown adults. And she stood behind me, and she bumped the back of my knees to tell me to get away from the water fountain. She wanted to get a drink. She bumped the back of my knees. Boom! You know, I'm like, did you do that? Okay. And she's like looking horrified, like, uh-oh, I broke him. I don't care that much for him, but I know my sister does. And no, my sister-in-law's great. But you really notice it when you lose muscle spindle function. That's what happened with this auto accident I was in. I damaged my spindles, so I just do little movements, carrying a book, things that you wouldn't expect, and I get spasms. And I'm just shocked how here it is 8 weeks later, and I pick up my book bag just wrong, and I get spasms up and down the body. But physical therapist goes, well, it's your spindle system remodeling. Well, I wish it was done. But we use it all the time. We use it all the time. And for fine motor movements, for tensing, and don't spend much time looking on this, so don't worry about it. But there is one thing that I want you to appreciate from this, is when a muscle is contracting, those extrafusal fibers are shortening during a concentric contraction. Those intrafusal fibers have to be the same length. So if your extrafusal fibers shorten by 20%, your intrafusal fibers have to shorten the same amount. If they didn't shorten and you suddenly had a stretch at any point, they'd be baggy and they wouldn't sense the stretch. So these gamma motor efferents, what do as you go through a concentric contraction? They're keeping the intrafusal fibers exactly the same length as your extrafusal fibers. So if a stretch comes about, it can be activated at any point. So those gamma motor efferents, they're really not generating tension for you. They're keeping those intrafusal fibers the correct length. So no matter if a stretch comes from this position or this position, those spindles will be able to sense it. It's a nice piece of engineering. Okay, so that prevents you from overstretching and tearing muscle tissue. The Golgi tendon apparatus and Golgi tendon reflex prevent you from generating too much force and damaging your musculoskeletal system. So you have tension sensing receptors located in tendons, not all tendons. This isn't all tendons, all muscles, but there's many of them in the body. If the magnitude or rate of tension development is great enough, the receptors are activated. And what happens? So if tension gets too high right here, it will send a signal to the spinal cord, which will set off a process that is going to stop the motor output that was generating the tension to begin with. So you're generating tension, and all of a sudden, boom, your muscle relaxes. You go, what the heck was that? And every now and then you'll see ice skaters or height jumpers or triple jumpers. They'll have a pop. They'll just be in the middle of a jump and all of a sudden they just came away. You know, they've had a very strong muscle reaction, a muscle tension generation, and it just shuts off neurological stimulation of that muscle because it was almost too much for the musculoskeletal system to absorb. So this prevents, not, you know, it can prevent muscle tearing, but it's far, far more important. It prevents tendon avulsion, tearing the tendon right out of the bone. So the way this works is, so you're just sitting here, you're relaxed, and this you can't really get right from your notes. You kind of have to watch this one. So you're going to do a voluntary muscle contraction. So a little bit of motor output and you get some tension generation. More neurological output, greater tension generation, even more motor output, great tension generation, and those strains are going to be felt in these connective tissues, and that's where the Golgi tendon apparatus is. And if that tension is so high that it risks tearing the muscle right here or pulling out the insertion, what can happen? That Golgi tendon apparatus is activated, and that is an A-alpha sensory neuron. It's going to come in here, it's going to activate an inhibitory interneuron that very quickly and very powerfully is going to generate IPSPs on this efferent motor neuron. So what does it do? It turns off that motor neuron that was generating the tension to begin with. Your brain, you still might be trying to contract the muscle, but this is locked, that signal now. And so that muscle relaxes, boom, just like that. It prevents you from generating so much tension it can damage your body. So the contraction abruptly stops. Now this is polysynaptic. There's more than, anytime you have more than one synapse, the stretch reflex was monosynaptic. This is 1, 2, it's more than one, it's polysynaptic. It's a little more complicated. And, but during times of great stress, we've all heard incredible stories when people have generated they've had incredible feats of strength, generating tremendous forces to do certain things. So here's an example. Here's one of our former dental students. And she was changing the tire in the car. It was rear passenger side tire was flat, so she was out changing it. So here's a couple pictures of her friend John Hill and his magnificent arms and the tremendous strength that he has. And here's a picture of John holding up her car. But he was in the apartment. She was outside changing this flat, and she was getting ready to pull the tire. It was jacked up, getting ready to pull the flat tire off, and the jack slipped. So the fenders came down on her arm. So she's pinned. She's pinned between the wheel well and the tire. Comes out, smash both her arms. So she does what everybody would do. She screams. John comes out and immediately, without thinking, grabs the car and he lifts it up. He didn't just lift it up a little bit. He lifted the car up. And then she pulled her arms back. And I hear somebody who's going to use her hands for a movie. And so I immediately go to the emergency room. She has some bruising, no broken bones, no neurologic damage, nothing but some bruises and being scared to death. And he lifted up the car. And you hear about mothers lifting up very heavy things off of children. So during periods of great stress, our bodies can some way, somehow, very rapidly inhibit that Golgi tendon reflex. Otherwise, you couldn't do this kind of thing. This was down in Louisiana a couple of years ago. I'm not going to play the video, but there were two girls, I think one was 12 and one was 14. Tractor rolled over and was crushing their dad, and it was a good-sized tractor. These two girls came over, lifted it up, Dad shimmies out, and they set it down. And so the news crew comes over and says, "We want to see you girls lift the tractor." And, you know, the girls nearly hurt themselves going, you know, they couldn't budge it. They couldn't budge it, but, you know, they lifted it right off their dad. And he said, "Well, it happened so fast, you know, we didn't even think that we're holding this thing 2 feet up, and then we let it down, and, you know, we're worried about Dad, and worried about Dad." And the hospital's like, "What the heck did we just do?" You know? So there, during times of stress, we can some way, somehow turn that off. And also, with tremendous physical training, people who are in high power, high strength sports, there is some evidence that those people can train and perform closer and closer and closer to the limit. Their body will allow them to get closer to the limit before they have the shutdown of that muscle. And well, I was years ago, boy, it would have been late 70s, back in the bad old days of powerlifting when so many people were on some nasty amounts of anabolic steroids. You bump into one of these, the big guys who was sweating and just getting the sweat on, you'd probably today test positive for a month. And anyway, this guy is going to do a deadlift, and boom, his bicep tendon just explodes. And his bicep comes up here, and he drops it. He goes, "Oh my God!" I'm going, you know, they kind of get him and they lead him on stage. And you know, all of a sudden he's got a double D cup up here, you know. And I talked to a surgeon about, my God, how do you pull that muscle down? And this was a super weight guy, so he was like 280 pounds of muscle. And he said, man, he said, it's cranes, it's pulleys, you know, there used to be a reason why orthopedic surgeons were all former football players. They were big, strong people. Just pull down these tendons, a couple people pulling them down while somebody else tacking them. Now, I've seen so many small people, women, guys, whatever, because now there's these great pulleys, these apparati that you look at some of the machines that they use in orthopedic surgery, and it looks a little bit like something you'd expect to see in a dungeon. Like, you know, it's to stretch these things out. And I asked the surgeon, how do you deal with that? He says, well, it takes 3 strong residents and a very compliant pony to pull down that tendon so I can tack that sucker down sufficiently. And it wouldn't surprise me if, but now there's equipment to do that. A couple of other types of reflexes. Once again, these are built into the spinal cord. You don't need to think about them. They're built in. Nature gave them to us. Here's what's called a flexor withdrawal reflex, and we've all had this. Let's say you put your hand on something really hot. Put your hand on something really hot. Even before you recognize it as being hot, you might recognize something's not right. You're yanking it back. So adverse stimulation and boom, it's coming back. And that's called a flexor withdrawal reflex. And what happens with this type of reflex is the flexing muscle, most of these withdrawal reflexes, they're flexor reflexes, but the withdrawal muscle, the flexor, is very quickly contracted. And at the very same time, and this is where it gets very, very cool, is so here we have that adverse sensory stimulation. It comes in and there's built-in neural circuits here that you will activate the flexors, and at the very same time, you're going to have the reciprocal inhibition of the extensors. This wouldn't work very well if you did not inactivate the extensors. So this is called reciprocal inhibition. So you activate the flexors, you inhibit the extensors. And we've all done this. You step on something sharp, your hip flexors immediately contract. So there's a whole lot of these flexor withdrawal reflexes built into us. They're built into the spinal cord. And a normal, healthy person, they have them. Some people with neurological deficits, they don't. Now, it's not just on the side of the body where you experience some painful stimulation. It also goes to the other side of the body. And, you know, some of you have probably noticed this. If you have over here, this is the flexor withdrawal reflex, but what's happening on the contralateral side of the body is exactly opposite. You activate the extensors reflexively, and you inactivate the flexors. So the movement, I'll let you write that down, and I'll show you what the movement looks like. And almost all of us have done this. Okay, you put your hand on something bad, and you go, boom. You withdraw on one side, and you push off on the other. and it happens very, very quickly. This reflex also goes down into our legs, and we drive off on one side and flex on the other, but don't worry about that. But this is called the cross-extensor reflex. It's the continuation, it's the second part of the flexor withdrawal reflex. It's to get you out of that dangerous situation. It's built in. It's built in. You don't have to think about it. So there's so many wonderful reflexes built into the spinal cord. There are posture reflexes. Posture is a very complicated thing. You know, you watch a little kid learning how to walk for the first time. Man, they're working hard. They're working hard. Well, your body's been getting it better for years and years and years. So there's a lot of posture reflexes at your hips, at your knees, at your ankles, associated with your head. There's at least 6 different walking reflexes. I just put a couple. A rhythmic stepping of a single limb. If you have an extension at the hip, once you get to a certain point, you automatically then activate the flexor. You can have people anesthetized and put them on tables, and you can elicit these reflexes. You have a reciprocal stepping of the contralateral limb. So if you're pushing off with your right leg, you're extending, you're flexing, at the hip with your other leg. Stumble reflex. We've all done this, walking up some steps, and you misgauge how high that step is, and you just tap the step. What do you immediately do? That forward movement of the leg stops, and your other leg, it just goes up, and your other leg just locks like that. So stumble reflex is actually a complicated reflex. So there's many, many movement reflexes built in your spinal cord for your legs and also for your arms. There's also gastrointestinal reflexes built into the spinal cord. There's blood pressure reflexes built into the spinal cord. Had a friend who, like I mentioned, a lot of upper neural traffic is actually, it's inhibitory. It dampens spinal reflexes. So if you have damage to the spinal cord, if you have damage to the spinal cord, it's kind of interesting that right after you have damage to the spinal cord, you have loss of some of these reflexes, and then within a couple of days, then you have excess reflex activity. I have a friend who has spinal damage, and he has world champion, tendon reflexes. They're incredibly exaggerated compared to before his injury. So during the spinal shock period, you might lose some of these spinal reflexes, and then unfortunately, they become exaggerated. Once again, this is just circuitry in the spinal cord. And it can lead to something called autonomic dysreflexia, and I think I've probably taken the slide out. That once again, there's GI and there are blood pressure reflexes built in, and in his case, he could not he can't sense pinching of the skin in his lower extremities. He's lost sensation, but his spinal cord will pick up on it, and it will activate a reflex that would cause his blood pressure to actually soar. That's autonomic dysreflexia. And so all sorts of different things. He could be right at the beginning of getting a urinary tract infection, while it's still subclinical, and his blood pressure would be doing weird things. And so there'd be all these spinal reflexes going on, and luckily over time his autonomic dysreflexia has decreased a lot. But there's so many things built into the spinal cord that even if you can't elicit motor function and you have no sensory function, these reflexes are still going on, and they can be affecting your autonomic nervous system. It's a big problem. I shouldn't take time with this, but I'm going to. Years and years and years ago, when I was, my last course I took for undergraduate school, I had one course left to get my degree in biological sciences here at UNL in town. And it was Introduction to Ecology, a sophomore course. So I went out to what's called the Cedar Point Biological Station, out past Ogallala by Lake McConaughey. They have a real nice field station. They offer classes out there. So I took Intro to Ecology out there. It was great, three and a half weeks. There was this guy from Ohio State. So there would be researchers from all across the country that would come out then to do their field research in the summer. There was this guy from Ohio State. He was really kind of a frontier man, a mountain man type guy. He only fed his family things that he grew in his garden and things he hunted. And one Saturday morning, he's going, I'm diving for snapping turtles. And we're like, well, you know, these were big snapping turtles. And he was just a little guy. We're like, well, we'll stand here on the shore, and so we can notify your next of kin when you come up. And we were sure he's going to die. He goes down, he pulls up one big 40-pound snapping turtle in his second one, and so he's going to kill the turtles and get the turtle meat. He lops off the head of the turtles, and he kind of drafted us into helping him take the shells off these things. So one of the things, the point is get the shell off the turtle. His head's been gone for 45 minutes. And you could poke the turtle in the ribs. It would reach down with its front claws, grasp your finger, and pull it away. It's like, man, that's spinal reflexes. That's purely spinal. It's pretty impressive. And so we have impressive spinal reflexes. Well, other organisms do too, but that was the most astonishing I've ever seen. Here's just a little bit of something to, we have a lot of postural reflexes. We have something called the H reflex. It's the posterior compartment of your leg versus the anterior compartment of your leg. They have to fire in a coordinated fashion for you to stand upright. And so here was, boy, this was back in 1999 when I first read this. There was a group in England they were looking at this postural reflexes, H reflex, and they had kind of a smart alecky medical student who would put the electrodes on the patients, and he told jokes all the time to put them at ease. And when they'd be looking at the strips, as soon as they got the electrodes on, they'd be looking at the strips to make sure everything was attached just fine. And they'd see these periods when the neurologic activity would just drop. And it's like, well, what's going on? The electrode's going off? And so they started to pay attention. This guy was always telling jokes, and every time you tell a joke that made somebody laugh, boom, the nerve output to those muscles would stop. And we've all heard probably the term falling down laughing, or weak in the knees with laughing. So they went, well, wait a second, there's something going on here. This smart alecky kid always telling jokes is shutting off their nervous output to their lower legs. How the heck is that working? And they did some pretty cool graphs, and they said weak with laughter, this has been the idea of falling down laughing. That's been in literature for close to 1,000 years, it was first described. It turns out it's not laughter. A couple of years after that, some guys take kind of the fun out of it. And it turns out when you do a forced expiration, and that's laughing is a forced expiration. If you do a forced expiration, it can make you weak at the knees. And for example, most of you have had the wind knocked out of you. Guess what? I bet you weren't standing around, walking around when the wind was knocked out of you. I bet you were lying in the dirt thinking, I'll never breathe again. It was a good run, But it turns out that this is just one of those quirky little things that during a forced expiration, for whatever reason, and it probably is a selective advantage for them, I have no idea why, but that postural reflex is turned off. So, weak with laughter, you know, falling down laughing, well, there's a physiologic reason for it. Okay, we're going to get started on the next set of notes, which is the muscle contraction. We're going to do muscle contraction first, and then we'll do autonomics. So, oh, and I should mention these special senses, what I've always done for years, is there will be a series of, there's pretty short PowerPoint presentations. You have all of the information now to go slide by slide and learn that on your own. These will be independent study modules, and they won't actually be for exam 2. They'll be on exam 3 and the final exam. So these, I'll be posting them. I'll try to get some of them up next week. And whenever you have time, you can go through, and using the fundamentals that you have now, you can go through, and I'm sure most of these special senses you've worked on before in physiology classes, and it just seems to be a good way of ensuring all healthcare programs require students to demonstrate that they can be self-learning with independent study modules, and this is one way in this course we can demonstrate that. So, here are, I did give you this slide, didn't I?
Yes.
Okay. Believe it or not, I cut out quite a bit. So here's the sections that I told you to start reading last time in the tables, and here's the figures in this 915. The reason why that's in parentheses is I want you to appreciate it, but I don't think it's necessary for you to memorize that one. 915, there's a lot to it, and I just don't think it adds much. But you can see we jump from 915 to 931 when we talk about twitch characteristics, and some of that information is important, but I don't know for you guys what you're going to be doing clinically if all of it's important. Now, here's a table at the end of your chapter. One thing that I strongly suggest that you do, actually with any of these chapters, I think you ought to read the chapter backwards. At the very end of every chapter, there is an outline. And I think you ought to read all those outlines 2 or 3 times before you jump in and read the chapter. Those outlines are excellent. Once you've read the chapter, read the outline again. This book distills a lot of information very well in the outlines. It will be everything you need to know, but they really help organize your thinking. This is at the very end, characteristics of muscle cells, contrasting, comparing between skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, single unit smooth muscle, multi-unit smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, with all these different things. So, take a look at this table, and as you're going through the material, keep reflecting back on this table to make this table make sense for you. Okay? This is a good way of organizing your thinking via this table. So, yeah, they put it at the very end, but I think you ought to preview it early. Go, okay, I'm going to be worried about the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I'll be worried about gap junctions, source of calcium. Just kind of know these characteristics, and then when you go through the material, go, oh, well, this fits here. Okay? A little bit more active learning. So, here is one of the first figures for, we're first going to look at skeletal muscle contraction. Because if you understand skeletal muscle contraction, smooth muscle contraction and cardiac muscle contraction, a lot easier. Are there differences? Absolutely. But if you learn this one first and you learn it well, by looking at what's similar and what's different, contrasting, compare, the other two fall in line a lot more easily. And I'll tell you right off the bat, smooth muscle contraction, it's kind of a mess because there's so many different types of smooth muscle. There's some react to certain stimuli, other ones react to totally different stimuli. So we're just going to talk about the fundamentals of smooth muscle contraction, and then later on talk about, okay, in a resistance arterial, here's how the smooth muscle relaxes. reacts. So if we look at a whole muscle, we'll see that it's made up of myofibril. So here's a myofibril, and what really is it? It's made up of sarcomeres. Y'all remember sarcomeres from your first physiology courses. They go from Z line to Z line. They're the functional contractile unit in skeletal muscle. So when you activate a myofibril, all of those sarcomeres are activated. If you look very closely in a sarcomere, you can see that there's thin muscle filaments and there are thick muscle filaments. And we're going to go through these slides one at a time and see that the thick filaments, they're myosin. And myosin has cross bridges. And the thin filaments, well, they are two strands of globular actin and two other proteins, tropomyosin, which is the blue in this, and then troponin. And troponin turns out to be the calcium binding protein that's found in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. In smooth muscle, it's not troponin, it's calmodulin, okay? So, I didn't give you this picture, but look at it. This is like the big picture understanding of how muscle can generate tension. And when I say, I'm going to be showing you a slide coming up. When you hear muscle contraction, most people just think shortening. But muscle contraction means generating tension. Because you can be contracting your muscle and put a weight in your hand that's so heavy that your arm's going to go down. So while you're contracting, the muscle's actually lengthening. A lengthening contraction is called an eccentric contraction. A shortening contraction is called a concentric contraction. And what's contraction? It's tension generation. So here we have these thick filaments interacting with the thin filaments, and what we're going to see is the cross bridges will interact with the thin filaments, and then they will ratchet inward. And what do? They pull the thin filaments toward the center of the sarcomere. And that shortens the sarcomere, that shortens the muscle. So that would be a concentric contraction. If this is causing that sarcomere to shorten from C line to Z line, that would be a concentric contraction. But engagement and what's called cross-bridge cycling, that leads to tension generation. In this picture, it's leading to shortening of that sarcomere and therefore the myofibril. So this would be a concentric contraction. Let's look a little more closely at that thin filament and the thick filament. So the thin filament, if you look real closely, these white things, these are globular actin, that they are arranged in two filaments that are twisted around each other. And there are these blue long proteins called tropomyosin, and they are associated with troponin. And troponin is actually linked to actin, and it's linked to tropomyosin. Well, that tropomyosin is actually covering, it's hard to see right here, but it's covering the binding sites that's found on the myosin heads. The myosin heads have actin binding sites. And when a muscle is relaxed, this tropomyosin is covering these binding sites on the actin. Okay? So ATP is going to play a role in helping to power this process. And these actin binding sites are going to play a role. So I only gave you one of these two slides. So here we have relaxed muscle. It's relaxed because there's low cytosolic calcium. What's the trigger for skeletal muscle cross-bridge cycling? It's actually when calcium gets to a certain level. When calcium gets to a certain level, it's going to bind troponin and set off a whole series of reactions. So here we have low cytosolic calcium. With low cytosolic calcium, these actin binding sites, boy, do they want to interact with actin. They have high affinity for actin, but they can't get to these actin binding sites because tropomyosin is covering them up. What happens when you have high cytosolic calcium? It binds troponin. Troponin tugs on the tropomyosin. What does it do? It pulls the tropomyosin away from those binding sites that are found on actin. And that allows the myosin head, cross-bridge head, to bind to those actin binding sites. And as soon as it does that, as soon as it binds those actin filaments, you get what's called the power stroke. That head is going to ratchet inward, and it's going to pull this thin filament to the center of the sarcomere. Some of this starting to come back to you? This is something every physiology course goes over in great detail. Now, where does the calcium come from? Where does the calcium come from? In skeletal muscle, it comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We'll see in smooth and skeletal muscle, sarcoplasmic reticulum is a depot for calcium, but you also need extracellular calcium. The skeletal muscle, you do not. You do not. So here are these blue things. These are these sacs, and they're wrapped around these myofibrils. And these sacs are the sarcoplasmic reticuli, and they are filled with calcium. They're filled with calcium, very high concentration of calcium. And there's channels that when those channels are closed, the calcium stays inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You don't know it, but there are calcium ATPase pumps. They're constantly pumping calcium in from the cytosol into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And there's a lot of calcium in there. But if you open up membrane channel proteins, there's so much calcium there it can diffuse out into the cytosol. You see some other things. Here's the sarcolemma. This is the membrane of that muscle. And there are these holes in it that lead down what are called T-tubules. And what we're going to see is when you have action potentials generated up here on the surface of the sarcolemma or the muscle membrane, those action potentials will actually go down the T-tubules. And those action potentials will set off a signal transduction process to tell the sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium channels to spring open. So we're going to generate action potentials up here that are going to signal the release of calcium here. That will then bind troponin and start the skeletal muscle contraction phase. So what this is getting at with just another slide is each of these myofibrils, they're surrounded. They're surrounded by the sarcoplasmic reticuli, and also the transverse tubules come down, so there's communication with the sarcoplasmic reticuli in all areas. So the bottom line is you have the ability to release calcium in these myofibrils very quickly and efficaciously. So let's start off with the motor neuron. Here's a motor neuron. Let's say that is an A-alpha motor neuron, because this is a skeletal muscle down here. How do we get all this started? How do you get all this started? Well, A-alpha motor neurons, action potentials will come racing down. Action potentials will be going along the surface of these synaptic terminals, and as you've learned before, that is going to stimulate voltage-gated calcium channels to pop open. Calcium's going to come in. Calcium's going to bind calmodulin. It's going to activate synapsin. It's going to activate a series of steps that lead to what? The exocytosis of these packets containing the neurotransmitter, in this case, acetylcholine. So action potentials cause calcium influx here, which drives a process that leads to the release of neurotransmitter acetylcholine. You have, in this patch of membrane on skeletal muscle, that patch of membrane has a special name. It's called the motor end plate. You have a motor end plate. And what you have right here are acetylcholine receptors are actually what are called nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and they are a ligand-gated channel protein. So an acetylcholine, just like we've talked before, the ligand here binds its receptor. It causes that channel to spring open. And we've used this channel as an example several times. Primarily, it allows for sodium movement. So sodium influxes, this membrane is going to race toward the equilibrium potential for sodium, which is plus 61. So it's going to depolarize the membrane right here. It'll depolarize the membrane, and that current can spread to the right, it can spread to the left. And up here on the circle lemma, the blue part, the green is the motor end plate. This is where you have these ligand-gated nicotinic acetylcholine receptor translocation channel proteins. You get what's called an end plate potential, and that is an example of a graded potential. An end plate potential is an example of a graded potential. Normally, the release of acetylcholine will lead to enough depolarization that it'll get up here to the plasma membrane, and that's where you have voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels. If this patch of membrane depolarizes enough, it's going to activate the voltage-gated sodium channels, and you have the depolarization phase of an action potential. So action potentials will now race across that membrane. So end plate potentials, a form of graded potentials right here. If it depolarizes this adjacent membrane enough, then you'll get action potential sweeping across that membrane. Because you have voltage-gated sodium potassium channels up here. Not down here, but up here. Ligand-gated down here, voltage-gated up here. So everything we've talked about, the fundamentals. And, oh, I forgot. You don't want this acetylcholine to stick around forever, so this muscle at the motor end plate, it's actually releasing an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. Acetylcholinesterase. So once acetylcholine does its job, this acetylcholine will break down acetylcholine to an acetate subunit and choline. It no longer functions in binding that nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. So you don't want that acetylcholine to function forever. You want it to activate a muscle contraction, and then you want it to stop. So, acetylcholinesterase will do that. And by gosh, if it pops up in peanuts, you should know the term acetylcholinesterase. Can't even remember what it spell acetylcholinesterase. Maybe I shouldn't enter. Okay, so we'll take our break there, and we will see you on Thursday. So definitely read ahead for the rest of this muscle and get started on that chapter 12 for cardiovascular.
Will we have a quiz on Thursday?
Pardon me?
Will we have a quiz on Thursday?
Yes, there is a quiz on Thursday. It's not a pre-quiz. It'll be what you know quiz. Okay.
I had a friend who had narcolepsy, and when she laughed, she would just like completely lose all motor function and like fall over. Had never heard of that?
You know, I've heard of something like that once before, you know, and that just must be because she had other neurological problems going on. I wonder if she just had an elevated one of those H reflexes, but I've definitely seen people with high degrees of this that they just start chuckling and they